Hi, good afternoon. We're going to get started. My name is Deborah Gonzalez, and I'm the Director of Government Affairs at the Public Policy Institute of California, and thank you for joining us today. For those of you who do not know about PPIC, we're a nonprofit, nonpartisan think tank located both in Sacramento and San Francisco. Today's event is part of the James Irvine Foundation briefing series, and as always, we want to thank them for making these events possible. For the beer bread, it's a wonderful thing. It's a great gathering place for us. The research today that you will hear about is about automated voter registration, was also funded by the James Irvine Foundation, so I'd like to thank them for that as well. You should have found a copy of the report on your chair when you came in. The report is What to Expect from California New Motor Voter Law. Both authors are here today. Eric McGhee will present, and then his co-author, Mindy Romero from UC Davis California Civic Engagement Project is also here, and will join in questions and answers, but we know Eric, he's probably going to answer most of the questions. It's just the way he is. So. The report as well as the slides are available today already online and for your pleasure viewing pleasure at ppic.org. A couple more things before we begin. Later today, you'll receive a short survey. The surveys, we read them. We take your advice. We really like to hear from you. This is a panel on civic engagement in a way. Come on, people, let's engage. So it's awesome. And please turn off your cell phones because that's distracting to the presenters. So why are we here today? Not just because it's better than being over at the Capitol working on the state budget, which is never any fun. As somebody who did it for many years. But voter participation is very important. We all learned in grade school that a functioning democracy requires a voter participation. But why? Why does it mean? PPIC has released a number of reports in recent years, including one this year, that shows that a lack of voter participation means that the electorate is less representative of the demographic and socioeconomic makeup of the state. In extreme circumstances, this means a small minority is making decisions for most of the state's residents. While many of these decisions can be small, such as where to place a park in the neighborhood or a traffic light, some have long-standing impacts, such as imposing a tax on your home for 30 years or determining whether to spend money on schools or prisons. Voter participation is also vital to holding elected officials accountable. As a recovering legislative staffer, I can tell you that voters and their participation in the legislative process gets members' attention. On a more personal level, we often find it annoying when we hear that somebody is opining or concerned about what's happening in the world and didn't take the time to vote. So if Eric can help me with that annoyance, I really appreciate that. For all these reasons, this work is very important. Now, on to our presentation. Eric McGhee is a research fellow at PPIC, where he focuses on election, legislative behavior, political reform, and public opinion surveys. He's becoming my own political therapist. So I appreciate all the work you do, Eric. So now I'll turn it over to Eric.
I'm a therapist now. Thank you, everyone, for coming today. Just to get it out of the way, I'm not going to offer any thoughts, even though this is billed as an elections-related event. I'm not going to offer any thoughts on Harris v. Sanchez. I'm not going to offer any thoughts on whatever it was that Donald Trump said this morning. So just to get that out of the way. This is about elections wonkery. So as Deborah mentioned, we have something of a turnout problem in California. We've got almost 7.5 million Californians who are eligible to be registered to vote, but are not registered to vote. And in 2012 and 2014, we saw some of the worst turnout in the state's history, both in the primary and the general election. It was a little bit better in this primary that we just had, but we don't know yet whether we're really on the road to recovery. And also, as Deborah mentioned, higher turnout or higher voter registration is really crucial for improving civic engagement and making sure that our elected officials are listening to the population at large. So right now, the law, actually the federal law on registration is the Federal Motor Voter Act. It's obviously one of many laws, but this one implicates how people engage with the Department of Motor Vehicles. So when you go to the DMV under the Federal Motor Voter Act, you're given a choice to register to vote. If you decide that you want to be registered, actually even if you decide not to, then that information is sent to the Secretary of State. For those who said that they do want to be registered, they end up being put on the rolls. And this applies to all the main transactions that people would do at the DMV: getting a driver's license, changing their address, renewing an existing driver's license or ID, and through any medium like online or by mail or in person. And under this system, you're added to the voter rolls if you attest to being eligible to vote. You say, yes, I am eligible, I'm a citizen, I'm not currently in prison, that sort of thing. And you also actively agree to be registered. You say, yes, I do actually want to be registered to vote, add me to the rolls. If you don't say that, you won't be registered. We now have a new regime. AB 1461, passed last year, changes this in a pretty crucial way. So it's similar in the sense that it applies to the same transactions as motor voter, those DMV transactions, but now the default is to be registered instead of to not be registered. So you're added to the voter rolls under this new system if you attest to being eligible first, just like under the old system, and you do not actively decline to be registered. So if you say nothing, you'll be put on the rolls, as long as you attest to being eligible. And as we'll get into, that's a potentially very big change. And so what we're going to do in the rest of this presentation and what we do in the report is to talk about the implications of that potential change, using the recently passed law in Oregon as some context. And so what I'm going to do now is talk about sort of what we should be expecting from it, and then I'm going to talk a little bit at the end about the kinds of things that might impact whether people actually do or do not decline to be registered, or whether they attest to being eligible. That kind of thing. So the first question we want to look at is, how might the electorate change under this new system? And then we'll go into talking about what we might expect in the first year, because the law doesn't apply to just everybody. It only applies to people who come to the DMV after the law is first implemented. And then we'll get into that question that I just mentioned, like how many people might actually agree to be, or not decline, I should say, to be registered under this system. And then we'll offer some conclusions and recommendations at the end. So, okay, how many new people? If we had a sort of wildly successful new motor voter law, then we could see actually a considerable increase in the share of the registered electorate for different groups. So for each of these groups here, these are not mutually exclusive. People who have two foreign-born parents are much more likely to be Latino, for instance. But looking at each individually and comparing their share of the current registered population and their share of sort of our projection of where we could end up in terms of the registered population, you can see that there's some very big differences for certain groups. For those who don't have a college education, two foreign-born parents, Latino, those are some of the biggest categories, the biggest shifts, as much as 6.5 percentage point change in the electorate for those without a college education, for instance. But also for some other groups as well, moved in the last year, that captures mobility, which is people who move more often tend to be less likely to be registered to vote, for instance. And so it's a change that could make for an electorate that is more diverse, that is not as well educated, that is younger, and that is more mobile. So this then says, all right, that shows you how much the electorate could change with this reform. How would that compare to the population of all adults? Because in California, we don't just have people who are eligible to vote, we have a large population of non-citizens who are not eligible to vote, but are still sort of part of the general body politic. And if you want to know whether this change is going to affect them or not, because they are affected by state policy, then this is your answer. So the top line in each case is the underrepresentation of that group in the current population of registered voters. You can see for all these groups that we've picked here, there is an underrepresentation in each case. The bottom bar, the orange bar, is showing you how much smaller that underrepresentation would be under this new system. And in basically every case, it's smaller. It still notably leaves a big gap for certain categories, especially categories that have to do with citizenship, which makes sense. Tend to overlap a lot with citizenship. Okay, second question. So the first question answer is it could be a fairly significant change if the law is successful. Second question is how fast could this happen? How many could be registered? We estimate how many could be registered in the first year, for instance. And again, because the law only applies to those who are using the DMV after the law is first implemented, which currently is slated to be July of 2017. So the first thing to note is that there just are a lot of people who use the DMV for the transactions that are covered by this law. About over 5 million for driver's license renewal. That's the king daddy of these transactions. Address changes 2.2 million. ID renewal is 1.1. It's just that's a lot of churn in any given year through the DMV. Now we have to keep in mind when we're thinking about how many might actually sign up, how many new registered voters we would have, is that a lot of those people are already registered to vote. Somewhere, on average, between 70 and 80% of them are already registered to vote. Though it's worth keeping in mind that the number who are already registered is likely to be a little bit on the low side for this population, because those who are engaging with the DMV tend to be young and mobile, right? If you're getting an address change, it means you just recently moved. If you're getting a new driver's license, most people who are getting new driver's licenses are young. So there's a tilt toward a population that is less likely to be registered, and the more unregistered the population is that's using the DMV, the more we can get out of this law, right? So to develop our estimates, we adjusted for the likely age and mobility of this DMV population, and then developed some estimates of how many were going to be already registered to vote. So then we also have to take into consideration this, and we'll get into some of the thought process behind these numbers. But right now, we wanted to set sort of a range of expectations, right? Because there's a lot of people going through the DMV. How many of them are going to actually get registered, right, and not decline to be registered or not answer the eligibility question? So we did 3 different scenarios. A really low scenario where only 10% are saying yes, I'm going to be registered and I'm eligible. A medium where about 50% do, and then a high, that 93%, that comes from Oregon. Right now in Oregon, that's how many people are not declining to be registered under their new, there's the similar program that they have up there. Now there are some key differences. We'll talk about those in a second. But you can see that even for the medium scenario, the potential increase in registration is large. 7.5%, up almost 14% if you assume the really sort of gangbusters scenario. The low end scenario, if not that many people decide to sign up, it makes sense to think that it's not going to have as much impact. So, and under that scenario, that 1.5%, that's not even that much difference than sort of the normal up and down in registration numbers that we see as just as a natural course of events. So this raises a question: how many people are going to sign up under this program? And I think that's the $64,000 question. Though accounting for inflation, I don't know what would that be now, 64 million. How many who can sign up will sign up? What's the key issue there? Well, again, revisiting this, how this law works. To be registered under New Motor Voter, you have to say whether or not you're eligible to vote. But you don't have to say whether you want to be registered. So the attestation of eligibility is required, and the agreement to be registered is optional. If you say you don't want to be registered, they won't add you to the rolls, but only under that scenario. So this is an opt-in versus opt-out distinction, which is really key in all the research on these kinds of programs. Participation rates are much, much higher, generally speaking, under an opt-out scenario, where people are defaulted into something, and then they can say they don't want to do it, as opposed to being defaulted out of the program and saying they want to participate. So that makes the key consideration, really a lot of it circles around the eligibility question. So there's a lot of focus on the registration question, but under a new motor voter regime, the registration question actually becomes somewhat less important for adding new people to the rolls. The key issue is, will people say that they are eligible to vote or not? And how integrated into the rest of the driver's license form are those sorts of decisions, so people will see that they have to say whether they are eligible or not. So for the maximum impact, the solution is pretty straightforward. Make the eligibility question required in order to finish your DMV transaction. Now, how does all this compare to what Oregon is doing? There's a lot of discussion about what's been happening in Oregon. Oregon has very much an opt-out system. It's much more aggressive than what we have here. So first of all, you don't make any registration decisions at the DMV itself and as a part of your DMV transaction. Instead, after the fact, the Secretary of State determines by looking into the DMV database, determines who is eligible to vote or not, and then sends a card in the mail to those that they deem to be eligible. You have 21 days to return that card if you so choose. The card gives you the option to decline to register, and the option to choose a language preference, and the option to choose a party preference. Just all the kinds of things. I believe maybe disability is on there as well, disability status. So there all the kinds of things that you might be sort of boxes that you would check in a normal registration, voter registration form, are sent to you as a card in the mail. You have 21 days to respond. You can always go back after those 21 days and change any of that stuff, but it would require you to then unregister and re-register again, which is much more of a hassle. And if you don't send back the card, you are thrown onto the voter rolls. And the Secretary of State in Oregon will actually begin any day now, I think, starting to look back in time, 2 years, and finding people in the DMV database who used the DMV up to 2 years ago, and also doing the same for them, sending them a card in the mail. This is clearly a strong opt-out system, because if you're an Oregonian who just went to the DMV, you first of all have to notice a card in the mail that you were not expecting, right? Because you went to the DMV to get a driver's license or renew one or whatever. You didn't go there specifically to register to vote, and you have to be aware that this card is going to be coming, or at least notice it when it arrives. You have to fill out the card, which is sometimes more than people are willing to do, and you have to remember to mail it back. And you have to do all that within 21 days. And so that, I think, helps explain the really high uptake rate in Oregon. We obviously would love it if we get that rate in California, but we just don't know yet. And I think that's sort of, in our report, we present that as sort of the most optimistic scenario because of all of these differences. So conclusions and further thoughts. So the bottom line in terms of the estimates is that we could see notable differences, notable changes in the registered voter population under this law. It would become younger, poorer, less educated, more diverse, more mobile. There are, just by the very fact of it, plenty enough DMV customers in any given year to produce a large registration increase very quickly, perhaps more quickly than many people had expected. So then it comes down to not how many people would likely be touched by this law, but the design of the user experience, the customer experience, for those who do go to the DMV for some transaction. And so it really should, to have the maximum impact, it should be as simple and as straightforward as it possibly can be. So what do we recommend then? As I said before, first, the eligibility question should be mandatory. That would be the way to get the best bang for the buck out of this law. It would ensure that everybody who was eligible would be put into that eligibility status, and then they would just be defaulted into registration unless they said otherwise. And so that could actually produce quite a significant increase in registration. Because again, the research on these kinds of programs suggests that participation in an opt-out system is very high, even when you make it super easy for people to opt out. They still just don't bother, right? So people will be registered to vote if they can be established as eligible. However, just because you register somebody, automatic registrants are not automatic voters. So you still need to be sure to do outreach. Many of these new registrants will not have been engaged with the political system, will never have been contacted by a campaign, may not even really have a sense of civic engagement or awareness. It's important to reach out and say, hey, you're registered to vote. You should take advantage of that opportunity. There is also currently, the DMV has implemented a change to its registration form pursuant to a legal agreement where they have, for a long time, the voter registration form was separate from the driver's license form. And they've now integrated those two things together. But the only part that's integrated is the questions about eligibility and registration. And then you have to go to a separate touchscreen in order to enter other information, like whether you are whether you want to be registered with a particular political party, whether you are disabled, whether you have a particular language preference other than English. If you don't go to that touchscreen, you will be defaulted into being a no party preference who speaks English and does not have a disability. So, and that could be, if you don't know that that has happened to you, it could be a surprise on election day. So, that's a potential hurdle that, and just gets back to the whole outreach part of this, where that merging of the two forms with the touchscreen, that's how the new motor voter is also going to be implemented. It's just going to be sort of placed on top of this new merge is the backbone for the new motor voter as well. So that's something to be keeping our eye on for the future. And so we also recommend in the conclusions that we have open access to data so we can monitor this program as it unfolds. And in particular, it would be really great to know how many people are making it through this whole process. How far are they making it? How many questions are they answering? Are they answering the eligibility question? Are they answering the registration question? Are they going to the touch screen? These kinds of things that give a sense of the customer experience and how well that system is working for them. And that is it. So with that, I'd like to invite my co-author Mindy to come up and join me, and then we'll open it up to any questions you might have.
Hi, thank you so much. Has your research, or as you've looked into what's happened in Oregon, have you seen that increased voter registration has resulted in increased participation in elections?
Great question. We were just talking about that. So there has been some data that's come out for the most recent primary in Oregon that does indicate that turnout is a little higher, some really positive numbers. But being the fact that that's the primary and it's a kind of an unusual animal, it's an early look, but we don't know if those will necessarily, that participation rate will necessarily continue forward.
Yeah, I would also mention that the great majority of people in Oregon are currently, who are using this system, are currently being registered as non-affiliated, as they call it up there, or no party preferences, you would call it here. Yeah. And they would not have been allowed to participate in the presidential primary. So if they wanted to vote in the most recent primary, it had to be for other reasons. So like, for instance, a ballot initiative or something. So I think it's not a very good test case, but so far I'd say that given all those hurdles, the early signs are pretty good. So yes. Oh, Well, there was, why don't we, oh, okay.
Thank you. So there are two related questions. The first one is this the only way to get this information through DMV? The second question is, since the research is here and we haven't had a chance to read it, how are the demographics of Oregon compared to the demographics of California?
It's a great question. So in terms of data, DMV data is absolutely critical right now in terms of understanding what we would expect the impact will be, because we have to understand how many people are cycling through the DMV, right, to be able to do the estimates. In the future, who knows what reporting will bring, and other agencies or other entities that might be able to add additional insight in terms of data. But right now, DMV is the primary source. In terms of Oregon, I think you're implying in there, obviously there are huge differences in terms of demographics between the states. And that's a question. And really though, as Eric laid it out, as we are looking at it, the biggest difference is in the design of the two laws. And Oregon being much more aggressive, the reach back for 2 years, the opt-out, right, being a hard opt-out. So that's a driver right now that we can identify. That's going to be a strong predictor, the difference in terms of impact. Do you want to add anything?
The only thing I would add is that our best guess is that virtually everybody who is eligible to vote in California eventually gets either a driver's license or an ID. So the number of people who are sort of not touched by the system ultimately, right? So not, initially is another question, but ultimately down the road is going to be very small. And so again, it comes down to how many decide to become registered when they use the DMV under the system. We had a question over here.
Yeah, I was gonna.
Wait, can you wait for the mic?
I was gonna ask if you looked at if this might change political outcomes in terms of more Democratic election wins or Republican election wins or anything like that.
No, we did not. And I'm not sure I would want to necessarily speculate on that. Yeah, see my earlier comment about Donald Trump's. No, I think but if you were going to try and engage in that exercise, almost any change would be enough to change something at the margins if the population who's being added is different enough. But I think even even if we imagine large differences in terms of the political preferences of the new people who are being registered, I would guess that impact would only be felt in very close races.
And I'll just add something too. I mean, of course, there's going to be speculation about that in terms of party differences and political outcomes. But really, ultimately, this is a question of engagement. This is about increasing participation, right, and making the electorate more representative of the residents of the state, period. And then beyond that, it's up to those that organize, that mobilize, that run campaigns, right, to be able to bring these folks into their campaigns and their movements. But period, these people are going to be brought into the electorate.
In Oregon, is the card that is sent to the newly registered voters, is it franked or unfranked?
Is it, sorry, what?
Franked? Is it postage paid?
That's a good question. I would assume that it is, but I don't know for sure.
Yeah.
Hi. So it seems like the DMV process is like unnecessarily complicated, as to be expected, I guess. So are there any thoughts on why that is and how we can maybe move implementation towards like an easier one-step process versus it seems like you'll have a lot of drop-off of people having to go to a separate like touch screen and put in some work there, and I don't really see people actually wanting to do that after waiting at the DMV for a long time.
Go ahead.
Well, just to emphasize, this is a new two-step process that is separate from the implementation of AB 1461. And quite frankly, I mean, there is a lot of concern. We've heard a lot of concern from advocates and those that do voter education in terms of what that second step will mean, and to folks and the confusion that can bring, and certainly the party affiliation and the disability and the language question. So one step is to provide feedback, right? Getting data to track how many people complete that process so we know what the impact is. and then reaching out to give feedback on what the changes would bring. But I think data is going to be really critical to be able to understand right before we completely jump in on what a change might be.
So what does your research tell us about opt-out systems in general versus opt-in? For example, if you look at organ donating, do you think that this kind of research and data relates to those sort of systems as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think the organ donation is actually a good example. There's research that shows that if you, because I mean, if you think about it, organ donation is another sort of DMV related decision, and research there suggests quite substantial differences between defaulting people into an organ donation system and giving them the option to opt out versus asking them to explicitly sign up. I mean, it can be 40, 50 percentage point difference. It's really considerable. So now, again, we don't know for sure what's going to happen with this, but certainly it's consistent with all the research that if you make something opt out, you're going to get a better result in terms of participation than if you make it opt in. Over here.
I was wondering, sometimes people register, pay registration fees and other things through the AAA system with DMV. And I was wondering if there was any thoughts of engaging voters through that system.
Is that sort of like a, for registering your car, or is it?
Well,
The in-house
paying
DMVs.
fees and different things.
Oh.
You're speaking about the in-house when you go at AAA.
Yeah,
they
yeah,
have it.
because it's connected to DMV.
Yeah.
Oh.
Great question.
You guys are challenging us.
And to be honest with you, we didn't collect data on those very specific cases through the in-house AAA. So that's something we could certainly follow up on. So thank you.
I will say the new law does apply to any mode of engaging with the DMV. So whether you go in person or you do your transaction by mail or you do it online, it's going to apply to all of those. Obviously, the experience might be different for each one, but I guess I would assume it would also apply to these AAA offices, but couldn't know for sure.
And certainly the total numbers that Eric gave out earlier incorporate how people registered, right, different ways. So a AAA location would be included in those total numbers.
Hi. Do you know if there's any resources for like voter literacy? I mean, voter registration literacy. I mean, even like filling out the form. So if they're being provided any kind of resource to like, oh, what does this mean? What, like sometimes people sign up for the wrong party affiliation and things like that.
And you're asking at the DMV itself through that process if people are being informed?
Yeah, I don't.
Not that we're
I'm aware of. No.
Not that we're aware of. I think the goal, at least with the design of the form, as with other forms with the DMV, it's supposed to be self-explanatory as you go through, but definitely a good point that even when you go to your registrar's office and you've registered in person, people can have questions about what things mean. So, yeah.
With implementation coming in 2017, in terms of the development of the form, is it going to be a collaborative process between DMV and the Secretary of State, or is it siloed in just the DMV? And then, totally separate question, what effect would this have on vote by mail?
I think I would demur on the first question because it's that's a question for the DMV and the Secretary of State. Like how I don't think there's any mandate that they do it collaboratively necessarily, but how much they collaborate on the decision is sort of up to them, I think. And then what was the other question?
Vote by mail.
Oh, vote by mail. I think and that's actually a good question. I think that the default to be registered at polling place under this.
My understanding, yeah.
So I think you'd have to actually go and express a preference for
Sign
vote
up
by
as a-
mail at that if you were at the DMV at that touchscreen. So that would be another way in which maybe your preferences wouldn't be wouldn't be perfectly satisfied if you didn't go to that second stage.
It's a good question. I can add one small thing, not the question about the collaboration between DMV and Secretary of State, but there is a working group of advocates and folks that do voter education in the state, many organizations that you'll recognize that have been working with the DMV on the May revise process. And we haven't heard what officially is going to happen going forward with the rest of it.
No, May revise is the combination of these two forms.
The bullet point that Eric had up there, the new current system with the two-step process, and
that's called its lingo is May revise.
May revise, yeah. Thank you, Eric. So there's been a lot of back and forth and discussion and input given from advocates on that side of things, and we'll have to see going forward. We would expect that they would at least be reaching out about the eligibility question and how the opt-in is actually, or opt-out, excuse me, is actually designed and worded, or language around it.
Yes, and kind of a follow-up to the education process in terms of educating voters and such. What type of quantitative data or instruments you plan to use in terms of to really look at the effectiveness? How effective are you really in terms of not only educating but getting voter participation through the DMV process, although statutorily, but maybe there could be some regulatory changes to amend or perhaps enhance?
Well, so we do have thoughts. We have one additional study that we're going to do where we're going to go out and survey advocates and county registrars to get a sense of how the system is playing out and what things could be done to improve it as it's rolling out.
Its impact.
Its sort of impact, and that'll be sort of at different stages of the rollout process. And then we have a number of other project ideas that we'd like to do, and we'll sort of see whether they come to fruition. But there's all sorts of follow-up questions. We'd like to do a survey of the people who are newly registered under the system and ask them what their experience is. And
did they know they were registered?
Yeah, did they even know that they were registered, right? These kinds of questions. And we'd like to look at what happens in Oregon and see. And we've got an election coming up where a lot of people are going to have an opportunity to vote for the first time under this new system in Oregon, just to try and get a sense of how this kind of thing works. Do they turn out to vote? That kind of thing. And then down the line, we'd like to do the same thing for California once we have an election under our belt under the system. So.
It's really, these first two phases are part of a larger design that we felt was important to get a full picture, a comprehensive look at many stages, and hopefully we'll be able to do the additional phases. Anyone else?
Is that it?
There's one over there.
One more, yeah.
I was just wondering about people who aren't eligible, who just say, yeah, I'm eligible. Is there any concern about that? Or?
There's been a lot of concern leading up to the bill itself and the signing of it. Were you going to say something?
I was just going to say, yeah, I mean, that was the one of the reasons why the system in Oregon and the system in California differ so much is because we have the citizenship issue is so much more significant in California, and there were a lot of people concerned that if you did what they're doing in Oregon and just sort of added people, had the Secretary of State decide who was eligible and who wasn't, that it might end up putting some people who are not actually eligible onto the registration rolls. I mean, they're not eligible because they're not citizens, and then if they ever went to become a citizen, it could really damage their chances of becoming a citizen because the feds would say, hey, you're a fraud, you're registered to vote, right? So the idea of putting that explicitly into the process where you have to attest was meant to deal with that issue. There's always some chance that somebody would say yes anyway, but there's that problem on the existing registration form. So.
Yeah, and essentially our understanding is that there were several organizations that do advocacy for the undocumented community concerned about people inadvertently signing up and wanting to make sure that they were protected and they didn't break the law. Yeah.
Just avoiding the citizenship question entirely, just scalability in terms of comparing Oregon to California, where the entire state population of Oregon is smaller than some of our counties in California. How do you deal with those two very different size samples?
I think the answer is Oregon's all we got at this moment. So, so what you do is you report what's happening there. You note the obvious differences, significant differences, and just say, like, transparency. Like, these are the differences. So discount this information accordingly, right? But I think it's still important to report the information because we don't know for sure yet, right? We're sort of in the early stages of this in California. It could be our experience will turn out to be exactly like Oregon's. We think that's not likely, but it's not impossible. And so it's best to just sort of put as much information on the table as possible.
And the report does attempt to account for the differences that seem likely, right, in terms of impact between the two states. So the uptake, the different models around uptake, so the 93% and then the two lower rates give us at least a sense of what, depending on.
Sort of bookend it,
Yeah, bookend it, exactly. So that's our attempt to try to get a sense of if it's low to moderate to high, what can we expect? And when we start getting some more data, be able to maybe refine those going forward.
But again, I would just comment that I think the key differences are going to be about that uptake and not necessarily about the reach of the program, because there's so many people who go to the DMV to do one of these qualified transactions. So that's not as much of the issue as, is it because of our population differences, are fewer people going to, are more people going to say that they decline to be registered, for instance, or fewer people going to attest to eligibility? These are the kinds of questions that will ultimately determine how many people use the system in Oregon versus California, I think.
Follow-up. In terms of general election coming up in November, how soon do you guys anticipate having some data in terms of as a result of the election, after the election, obviously? I mean, within a year, within a quarter?
So you're talking about Oregon, or are you talking about?
No, California.
Oh, California.
Yes.
Oh, well, so California, it's not going to be implemented
Until 17, right.
Until
right,
17.
right.
So,
Well, you're gonna,
yeah.
well, you will start looking at what happened in Oregon, right?
Yes, that's our intent. Yeah, that's what we hope to do.
Then you're going to report back. I mean, you will come back with some information so we can look at moving forward.
Yes.
Okay. All right. Thanks.
If all goes well. So.
Should we let him ask a question?
I promise to ask a nice question to these two, but assume that there's an enthusiasm gap between those who opt in to register and those who didn't opt out to register and are still registered. And like Eric said, there's a chance that we increase registration, but no guarantee that turnout follows. That are we worried, or are you worried that there could be a perception that we increase the denominator but not the denominator, and thus turnout looks like it actually went down as a result of this program for at least registered voters?
I think both Mindy and I have long advocated for calculating turnout, generally speaking, as a share of all eligible residents and not as a share of registered voters. The registered voter number tends to be cited more often in the media because my theory is because they talk to campaigns, and for campaigns, the turnout among the registered is the key question. But as a policy matter, the key question is turnout among the eligible. And so there's really no way that this reform can reduce the turnout among the eligible, because what it's going to do is expand the population of registered voters and include some people who are low propensity voters. And so I think it's very likely that the turnout rate calculated as a share of the total registered is going to go down, but not as a share of the total eligible. It'll go up. So, and I think that's a very good point. It's something that we sort of have to hammer all the time, especially under this kind of motor voter regime. We should be focusing very much on eligible, a share of eligible and not share of registered.
And if I may add to it, I think it just comes down to expectations and education. For everybody in this room, anybody wanting to measure the impact, right, of this new law or reforms, period, is to understand that we would expect registered voter turnout, right, to go down, because you, at any population at any time prior to, kind of aside from this new program, you never get 100% registration out of everybody that you register, at least not on a large scale. And so that will happen, but that doesn't mean that that's a failure, right? And that shouldn't be the framing in the next or the first election that this applies to. We know we'll expand out the eligible turnout rate. The question is how much higher? And I think that's going to come down, as Eric mentioned earlier, to outreach and education and mobilization, getting all of those folks understanding how they differ and bringing them in as many as possible into the electorate.
So what happens in a situation where someone comes in to the DMV before the legal age required to register to vote, let's say 16 for an identification card, are they pre-registered so that once they turn 18, they are automatically registered, or do you require them to come back again and then register?
No, my understanding is this will be integrated into the pre-registration, no? So, and the pre-registration is going to go live soon. So, so moving forward, that's actually it's nice that we have. So pre-registration is where you can register to vote when you're as young as 16, but your registration record doesn't get turned on until you turn 18, right? So, but the idea is it gives you more opportunities to catch people when they're younger and so forth. I think that kind of a system dovetails really nicely with this, because a lot of 16 and 17-year-olds go to get a new driver's license, right? And if you didn't catch them at that moment, they might not, they'll have to renew again in 5 years. So you might not catch them again until they're in their early 20s. So I think it's a nice kind of combination to combine these two things together.
Anyone else? Did you Google that? We have a sharp member of my team in the audience, Greg Guyton, who just Googled, and we can answer the question. Oh, the gentleman's gone. The question around the postcard from Oregon from the Secretary of State asking people, right, to opt out or to identify their registration and so forth is franked. So they do provide postage paid. Yeah. Thank you very much. We've got that on the video, at least for anyone who watches it later, for the gentleman who watches the video later.
All right. Thank you very much.